Hello, and thank you for coming along today. Today we're going to consider the question, what do we learn from this global virus about the coming transformation of educational systems worldwide? We're beginning to look at the social implications of this global virus, and one of the big impacts it's going to have is upon the way in which humans learn about their environment, about their own fate, and about each other on the surface of the earth. This provides a huge challenge for educational institutions around the world. And we're going to see how this works in the coming months and years. In fact, liberal arts education in the Western countries have been under pressure for many, many decades, as Chomsky has pointed out. Most schooling is training for stupidity. We're in trouble because our educational systems have for decades been dumbing us down in reference to the environment.
When I graduate, I'm going to be a history teacher?
History teacher.
What do you suggest in the high school? What do you suggest I do in that context to keep from perpetuating?
Well, that's really important. I mean, a lot of people, I suspect many of you, if you think of your own experience, I know me, you can remember cases where a teacher really made a terrific impression on you. I mean, most schooling is just training for stupidity and conformity. But every once in a while, and that's institutional too, there are reasons for that. But occasionally, you get a spark. Somebody will challenge your mind, make you think, encourage you to think, and so on. And that has a tremendous effect. You just reach all sorts of people. Of course, if you do it, you're going to be, you may very well have problems. You have to tread a narrow line. There are plenty of people who don't want students to think. They're afraid of the crisis of democracy. People start thinking and you get all these problems I was quoting at the beginning. They won't have humility enough to submit to a civil rule, or they'll start trying to press their demands in the political arena, or they'll, have ideas of their own instead of believing what they're told. And privilege and power typically doesn't want that, so they can react. And a high school teacher who tries to get students to think may find repression, firing, and so on.
When a student asked Chomsky, what's the role of education, he responded at some length and with some humor. But the irony in it is not lost on the audience. In fact, they understand very quickly that what he's saying is true.
I'm wondering how you see the role of our educational system, what it's doing right now, what forces are driving it, and what constraints are on it, and how should it operate?
Mm-hmm. Well, I quoted the Trilateral Commission view of the educational system, namely it's a system of indoctrination of the young. And I think that's correct. It's a system of indoctrination of the young. That was the way the liberal elites regard it, and they're more or less accurate. So the educational system is supposed to train people to be obedient, conformist, not think too much, do what you're told, stay passive, don't cause any crises of democracy, don't raise any questions, and so on. That's basically what the system is about. Even the fact that the system has a lot of stupidity in it, I think, has a function. It means that people are filtered out for obedience. If you can guarantee lots of stupidity in the educational system, like stupid assignments and things like that, that the only people who will make it through are people like me and like most of you, I guess, who are willing to do it no matter how stupid it is, because we want to go to the next step, So you may know that this assignment is idiotic and the guy up there couldn't think his way out of a paper bag, but you'll do it anyway because that's the way you get to the next class, and you want to make it, and so on and so forth. Well, there are people who don't do that, There are people who say, I'm not going to do it, it's too ridiculous, Those people are called behavioral problems, or something like that. They end up in the principal's office or in the streets or selling drugs or whatever. And all of this is a technique for selection for obedience. And I don't know how to prove this, but I have a feeling that when you go to the elite universities, you find more obedience and conformity. probably because you're getting the students who were better able to do it. Well, all of that is functional. That's the way it works. And it works right through graduate school. I mean, by the time you get to graduate school, it's already a little more varied because some real contradictions develop in the system. The problem is that you can't have progress this way. Now, especially in the sciences and engineering, that's a problem because the corporations need science and engineering. If you don't have innovation, you're really in trouble. So they have to encourage creativity and independence because you can't get anywhere if you just copy what somebody told you. You have to be challenging things all the time, challenging everything, and thinking new thoughts and so on. And there you got a real contradiction. It's hard to train people to be creative and challenging and so on, and yet to ensure that somewhere else in their lives they're conformist and obedient and never think. So you have problems. It's a serious problem in Japan, incidentally. We think of Japan as this tremendous superpower, but that's very misleading. Japan, for example, is very poor in science, for example, and they're aware of it. And part of the reason is it's part of the same thing that makes them good workers, obedient workers. It's a very obedient society, very deferential and conformist society. And one effect of that is that there are real constraints against independent, free thinking, and you see it in the sciences very clearly. But it's a problem here too. So there are those contradictions. When you get to graduate school, they're beginning to show up. They show up much less in the ideological subjects, because there it doesn't matter so much if people have, profits aren't made by historians having original ideas about the French Revolution, so they can have conventional ideas. And that means that the pressure to try to support innovation and freedom is much less, and the pressures for conformity, on the other hand, are much greater, because in the ideological subjects it begins to be dangerous if people think the wrong thoughts. It's not so dangerous if they have new ideas about physics. But nevertheless, you begin to get a little flux in the system by the time you get to graduate school. And even at lower levels, you find it. I mean, there are teachers who do stimulate thought, and sometimes they get away with it. And all the way through, if people are learning things, you just can't control. You can't make them just regurgitate what they heard. Now, there's a lot of pressure to turn the schools into the Marine Corps, and there's a lot of support for it. For example, there's this bestseller last couple of years by Alan Bloom. That was all over the supermarkets, Closing of the American Mind. Huge bestseller, supermarket racks, which is where I read it, and things like that. Well, you take a look at what he's saying, and there was plenty, a lot of enthusiastic accolades for it and so on. He was saying that a couple of us smart guys will decide what the great thoughts are, and every student will memorize them, and that's education. Okay. Well, that's a way to turn people into pure automata. I mean, even if they happen to pick the great thoughts, there is no way less likely to get anybody to think about those thoughts than to make that the curriculum. That finishes them off, and I think that's the purpose, really. I mean, the purpose is just to impose authority, Here's the great thoughts. All this other stuff is rubbish. Just learn those and you're okay. I'll pick them, you memorize them. That's basically the line. Now, of course, that's the opposite of education. I mean, that's the way you study Talmud or something like that. But it's very popular, and I think it reflects the same concern over the crisis of democracy. In fact, Bloom himself was extremely... The incident that really got to him was a case in Cornell, where he was a professor, where some black students took over one of the buildings. And he said that's just like the Nazis, it's back to the Nazis. He has a whole business about the Nazis and so on and so forth. Well, you take a look at what happened in that. He doesn't tell you what he thought and he says the faculty capitulated, just like Heidegger capitulated to the Nazis and so on. What actually happened, if you look back, is that there were real grievances. Undoubtedly, the students shouldn't have done what they did and go into the building with guns and so on, but it was settled very amicably. It was settled amicably. Nobody was killed. The grievances were to some extent dealt with, and the net result was better than it was before. Well, he didn't tell you what he thought they should have done, but it's sort of implicit. I mean, I guess they should have bombed the place or something like that. But that's what really set them off. And in general, what set many people off was the 60s are now described in the literature as if it was a time when students were running around burning libraries and destroying the foundations of civilization and so on. What was actually going on is they were asking questions. They were raising questions. They were looking into things that people hadn't looked into before. They were not just obedient. And from the point of view of a lot of the faculty, that's equivalent to burning the buildings. You can't, that small distinction, you can't make that. There's pressure to turn the schools back to the days when you didn't have to worry about those things, like disobedient students asking questions about things that you didn't tell them to think about and so on.
More recently, Chomsky has emphasized the pressures on universities to drop education altogether and transform themselves as institutions into training, obedience, and indoctrination systems. There's been a systematic attack, according to Chomsky and others who've looked at higher education, a corporate attack on education. Yet there seems enormous pressure from both parents and conformity from students to accept this system and join in it at any price. Consider, for example, the college admission scandals that have rocked the United States in recent years. Parents and students seem to go to great lengths to want to get in on this system, even though they know it is corrupt.
Full House actress Lori Loughlin and her fashion designer husband are headed to prison for their roles in the college admissions bribery scandal. Chris Martinez reports the pair decided to drop their fight against federal charges.
Actress Lori Loughlin and her fashion designer husband, Massimo Giannulli, will plead guilty to conspiracy to commit wire and mail fraud after paying $500,000 in bribes to get their two daughters into the University of Southern California. Loughlin will serve 2 months in prison, pay a $150,000 fine, and perform 100 hours of community service. Giannulli will serve 5 months, pay $250,000, and perform 250 hours of community service. Loughlin and Giannulli were among 50 people arrested last year, and the 23rd and 24th parents to plead guilty in the case dubbed Operation Varsity Blues. Another high-profile defendant, actress Felicity Huffman, served nearly 2 weeks in prison after admitting she paid $15,000 for someone to fix her daughter's college entrance exam. U.S. Attorney Andrew Lelling said the famous couple's sentences are consistent with others who have been convicted, adding, "We will continue to pursue accountability for undermining the integrity of college admissions." Loughlin and Giannulli are avoiding a possible 20-year sentence. They'll make their formal plea Friday via video conference. Chris Martinez, CBS News.
So, what will happen next with the educational systems, both in the Western world and around the world? Well, recent signs are not good. An article makes this very clear by Naomi Klein in The Intercept. Andrew Cuomo, governor of New York, has been on recent calls with the Google executive chair, Eric Schmidt, talking about the Smart Schools Commission report. And Amy draws our attention to this in an interview with Naomi Klein about the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal is not the Green New Deal. Instead, it's a New Deal for corporations dealing in educational technology delivery systems. Google has already penetrated the school systems very effectively with Google Share, Google Classrooms, Google Photos of one kind or another, of Google platforms for teaching throughout the entire educational system, not only in secondary education, but right up through universities as well. Take a look.
But Naomi, we wanted to turn right now to your major piece in The Intercept. You talk about the pandemic shock doctrine beginning to emerge. As we turn to your new report that looks at how this crisis is more high-tech than previous disasters and how the future we're being rushed into could transform our lives into a, quote, living laboratory for a permanent and highly profitable no-touch future. This future was on display a week ago during New York Governor Andrew Cuomo's daily coronavirus briefing when he welcomed a video visit from former Google CEO Eric Schmidt and announced Schmidt will be heading up a blue ribbon commission to reimagine New York State's post-COVID reality.
The public-private partnerships that are possible with the intelligence of the New Yorkers is extraordinary. It needs to be unleashed.
Well, great. You are the person to help us do that. We are all ready. We're all in. We are New Yorkers, so we're aggressive about it and we're ambitious about it. And I think we get it, Eric. You know, we went through this period and we realized that change is not only imminent, but it can actually be a friend if done the right way.
This comes as Eric Schmidt has also been selling his services to the military-industrial complex. The New York Times reported on Schmidt's, quote, Pentagon offensive. Well, Naomi Klein, I want to ask if you can comment on all of this and particularly lay out your piece in The Intercept called Screen New Deal. Under cover of mass death, Andrew Cuomo calls in the billionaires to build a high-tech dystopia. Lay out your thesis.
Sure. Well, the billionaires I was referring to is he didn't just announce that partnership with Eric Schmidt, who will be chairing this blue ribbon commission to quote unquote reopen New York State with an emphasis on telehealth, remote learning, working from home, increased broadband. That's what they announced during that briefing. He also announced that he would be kind of outsourcing the tracing of the virus to Michael Bloomberg, another mega billionaire. And the day before, at the briefing, Cuomo announced a partnership with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to, quote unquote, reimagine education. And during all of these announcements, there's just been sort of effusive praise heaped on these billionaires. They're called visionaries over and over again. And the governor talks about how this is an unprecedented opportunity to put their pre-existing ideas into action. And this is what I've described as the shock doctrine previously. And we have talked on the show during the pandemic about what I would describe as kind of lower tech shock doctrines of the kind we've seen before, immediately going after Social Security, immediately bailing out fossil fuel companies. And I want to stress that all of this is still happening, right? The suspending of EPA regulations. So there's still this kind of lower tech shock doctrine underway with the bailout of these industries, the suspending of regulations they didn't want anyway. But there is something else going on that Eric Schmidt really epitomizes, and this is what I'm calling a Screen New Deal. And this is an idea that treats our months in isolation, those of us who are privileged enough to be self-isolating. And that in and of itself is an enormous privilege, because we have seen this sharpening and widening of a class dichotomy. And this relates to the calls to open up the economy, right? The people who are making these calls are not the people who are going to be most at risk. They're calling for other people to be putting themselves at great risk. And there's a feeling of being immune to the worst impacts of the virus. But that's another issue. What I'm calling a Screen New Deal really does is treat this period of isolation not as what we have needed to do in order to save lives. This is what we thought we were doing, right? Flattening the curve. But rather, and Eric Schmidt has said this elsewhere, he said it in April in a video call with the Economic Club of New York. He described what was happening now as a grand experiment in remote learning. So all the parents out there who are listening or watching, you've been struggling with supporting your kids on Google Classroom and Zoom calls, and you thought you were just trying to get through the day. Well, according to Google, you've been engaged in a grand experiment in remote learning where they are getting a great deal of data and figuring out how to do this permanently, because they actually believe this is a better way of educating kids, or at least, and coming back to our earlier conversation, a more profitable way. Eric Schmidt talked in that clip that you just played there, Amy, about all of the opportunities for public-private partnerships. And what he is really talking about is public money going to tech firms like Google, like Amazon, to perform public functions. So once again, a bonanza for the tech companies, who, by the way, have been doing very well during the pandemic already, where they see huge opportunities in telehealth, in the educational market in public schools, in supporting us working from home and learning from home, and you know, they're not looking for a kind of a traditional reopening, but rather a new paradigm where the privileged classes who are able to isolate themselves basically get everything that we need, either delivered through digital streaming or by drone, by driverless vehicle. And we're seeing a massive rebranding effort going on in Silicon Valley, where all of these technologies that were very, very controversial and where there was a lot of pushback way back in February, whether it's driverless vehicles because there have been all kinds of accidents, or drones delivering packages, or telehealth because of concerns about security for patient-sensitive information, or the benefits of having our kids in front of screens all day. I mean, I could go on and on. There was a lot of pushback.
Naomi, if I can, I'd like to raise something here, in both in terms of remote learning and in terms of telehealth services. My students at Rutgers did a survey of their fellow students on this issue of remote learning, and they found they did a survey of several hundred students. 85% of them said that their ability to concentrate on subject matter had been seriously reduced since the move to remote learning, and 65% of them said that their homes were not conducive to remote learning. So no one is taking into account the impact on the actual quality of the kind of education that students are receiving. The other aspect of this, I think, also is that whether it's in telehealth services or in remote learning, all of the material is then saved by the providers, so that whether it's a professor's lecture or whether it's the interview between a doctor and a patient, that is no longer a private situation. It's now recorded and saved to possible detriment of both the professor's right as a teacher or the patient's right in their private discussions with their doctors.
Well, these are huge concerns. And what is, I think, a truly toxic combination is the pre-existing for-profit models that Silicon Valley has been looking at and pushing when it comes to telehealth and remote learning, and the economic crisis that is being offloaded onto the states and onto municipalities by Washington, right? So we've had a series of bailouts, and again, the states and cities have been shortchanged, right? So the national economic crisis becomes a local austerity crisis, where you no longer have funds to pay for public health and public education, right? And that's where these so-called solutions that do allow you to archive information and engage in what they call predictive medicine, which requires fewer healthcare professionals, supposedly, or remote learning where you can archive the videos put online by teachers and they don't have to do it again. You just replay them the next year, right, Juan? So there's two forces here, right? There is the desire to cut back the actual human beings who are employed on an ongoing basis in favor of these kind of one-off big ticket payments for Silicon Valley. And what you were talking about before, Juan, about these huge inequalities and who is able to work comfortably from home. And I personally don't think it's I think most students are not enjoying this experience. There are huge inequities in who has access to broadband, who has access to laptop computers and tablets, but also who is able to learn well on screens. There are kids with developmental disabilities who have much more trouble just sitting in front of a screen for long periods of time. The tech companies are very quick to say, we can solve the technological gaps. We can buy tablets for every kid, right? Because that's another bonanza for them. That's public dollars that are going to go to paying for tech. Schmidt, in his capacity as chair of the Defense Innovation Board and the National Security Commission on AI, which is, Amy, you talked about that New York Times piece where he has been engaged in this a couple of years, push to increase federal spending on all of these technologies and saying, we're losing the AI arms race to China because they're investing much more in surveillance tech and also in 5G infrastructure. So all of these tech companies benefit massively if there are big public investments in broadband. So those are things that they're saying they can solve. But what they can't solve is whether kids are in a home environment that doesn't have a private space for them to work, that is very loud, that is abusive. These are not things that, Eric Schmidt and Google can solve. And they can't solve for, developmental disabilities that just mean that kids need to move around, as most kids do, right? So I think we're going to see very incomplete so-called solutions, and solutions, obviously, that massively benefit private tech interests. And we're not having a discussion about, well, look, if it is true that we are going to need to be spending more time in our homes, and if it is true that that access to technology is a lifeline, then should we be treating the internet as a commons, as a public utility that we govern, that is governed by our regulations and by democracy? As soon as you outsource the solutions to Eric Schmidt, who still has $5.3 billion in Alphabet shares, which is the company that owns Google, and who has holdings in all kinds of these tech companies, they are not going to put those public interest questions on the table.
Governor Cuomo has said that change is not only imminent, it can actually be a friend, as he chats about it with Schmidt. This is actually quite an insidious operation in the sense that we're getting a new kind of state corporate alliance congratulating itself about, in effect, taking over the new control of education of the young. But is this kind of corporate state alliance a healthy direction for future education? Many would argue most certainly not. We've seen what education does in the face of catastrophe. And we've asked the question, what do we really learn from universities in times of global crisis like the climate change crisis? Faculty has systematically come out against the investments, for example, that universities have in fossil fuel industries. But the corporations that control the universities, including the corporation of the university itself, Harvard, for example, is run in large part by its endowment. As student documentaries have made very clear, like this one called Veritas a few years ago. Among other things, what we've learned about education in the face of catastrophe is that despite their protests from students and faculty, universities behave like corporations. Why? Because they are corporations. If we depend upon them for the kind of paradigm shift in education that's going to be necessary in order to get beyond the growth paradigm, it's not clear we have a very strong ally. How can we shift from the growth paradigm to the sustainability paradigm? Well, universities can do it, but only if they start to explore how to do it, how to make the transition, the necessary paradigm shift from growth to sustainability. It's not at all clear they will. And it's from the business community and people like Ray Anderson that we may get more convincing arguments and plans for the transition to a sustainable future. We need to change the context in which we teach, as well as change the content of what we teach. We could move from philosophy, politics, and economics, a standard degree at Oxford, for example, to physics, philosophy, and ecosystem studies. It would still be PPE, but it would move from the focus on the econocracy, the dominance of the economics of public planning, to the great transition that's going to be necessary to live in a sustainable ecosystem. That's a huge paradigm shift, and not clear yet whether it's something that the universities can master.
Just take the case of agriculture. Humans don't produce food. We can't produce food. The best you and I can do if we go out in the sunlight is get a suntan. And if we stay out there too long, we'll get sunstroke. But we don't photosynthesize. We depend on other organisms that do photosynthesize, right? There's a ratio between the green leaf and the human population. As I say, anybody who thinks that humans can infinitely expand has no idea about how an ecosystem functions. In an ecosystem, all you can do, your best role as a human species, is to learn how to favor the environment for plants to grow. In other words, you can produce topsoil. Topsoil produces food. And if you're lucky, you can get enough of that back to you to keep going. But if you're not producing topsoil, if in fact you're doing what every country, in every continent, in every culture is doing at this point, destroying topsoil, you're on the wrong side of the evolutionary trip here. And your journey won't be long. So, advice? I had a plan a while back for PP&E at Oxford. They have a philosophy, politics, and economics degree here, which they're very proud of. It's absolutely misfocused. It should be physics, philosophy, and ecosystem science. PPE, but physics, philosophy, and ecosystem science. Why? To learn that we're not the center of a complex ecosystem, and to learn how to use all the physics we can muster and all the philosophy we can manage to absorb, to realize that we, as a part of a functioning ecosystem, we've got to learn how to be a participant, not a dominant species. So you got a new PPE degree. You invent it. Tell them they should give you a diploma for it, because they don't so far. In fact, they're giving out these PPE degrees for people who think they're in charge. The growth economics is the answer. It's the biggest mistake in human history.
New orientation to educational systems around the world is now both possible and necessary. We need now, more than ever, to recapture our educational systems and reorient them toward learning about human survival in a complex ecosystem under conditions of rapid climate change with novel and resurgent diseases. These diseases are not going away. What we need to do to adapt to them is change our behavior. Think about our system role in an ecosystem and learn how to adjust. People like Naomi Klein, who've been characterized by her grassroots global vision, have been talking about educational systems and an awareness that's going to be necessary for human survival. What have we learned from this global virus about the coming transformation of educational systems worldwide? Well, we've learned that there's a huge challenge ahead, very nearly ahead. In fact, in the response and the public policy steps that are taken to rebound from the global virus, we will be, whether we like it or not, making real choices about the direction of our educational system. Will it become more of a delivery system of information and obedience from corporations through mechanisms that they've automated and made us, in effect, consumers of that kind of education? Or will it be an occasion for us to rethink our role in a complex ecosystem and learn how to respond in such a way that we can survive sustainably over time?